Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, welcome to the weekend, everybody. Another week down, and before you know it, the new week will be here, unfortunately. But let's enjoy the weekend while we can. So before we get started in today's episode, I wanted to just touch on a couple things briefly before we get into the real meat and potatoes of this episode. So I'm sure most of you have probably experienced going down the rabbit hole on something, and that was me this week. So earlier this week, I came across someone. It was on the, I believe it was on the r/HomeLab subreddit. They posted a diagram of their home network, and boy, oh boy, if that thing wasn't beautiful. That thing looked so nice. It was so meticulously diagrammed and drawn out and labeled, and oh man, it was so good. So they have a couple categories on there. Surprisingly, it wasn't under lab porn, although it might as well could have been with how beautiful that thing looked. But anyway, that pretty much inspired me to make one of my own home network, to diagram it up and make it all nice and pretty. And man, it's so nice to look at. Just seeing all the services that I have running and all the systems that I have running. It really puts it into perspective of, as some people would consider, how much of a problem I really do have. I don't see it that way, but, to each their own. So I'm curious to know, I'm assuming everyone's kind of, gone down that rabbit hole at some point where they just really get into something, really get into a project, get really invested into it, and just sink hours and hours into it over the course of a couple days, weeks, months, however long it takes to complete. But yeah, that was me this week. But I don't regret a second of it. It was great. But the irony of it is, even though I'm kind of sort of done with it, I'm also never really done with it, because as the home labbing hobby goes, your lab is never finished, right? You're always either adding new services, removing services, changing services, adding new hardware, swapping out hardware. You're always making changes and updates. So that chart is always going to have to be changed and updated and maintained. OSs are going to change, systems are going to change, services are going to change. At some point, I'll probably add more hardware, inevitably, because it's me. I might swap out hardware once things start really getting old, and the new good stuff that's out in the enterprise world now, once it gets onto the used market and is nice and cheap, I'll probably be upgrading to that stuff. But that'll be a while yet, but it still is fun. So some other news that happened this week is the redesigned MacBook Air with the M2 chip was released. We mentioned this device back at WWDC in June on the podcast. So basically, it seems like largely positive reviews. The major gripes that I've been seeing people are having is the SSDs are slower compared to the M1 MacBook Air, but I believe the main reason for this is Apple. If you look at the board of the MacBook, well, specifically the MacBook Pro with the M2, and I'm assuming the MacBook Air as well, you'll notice that Apple only decided to put one NAND flash chip on the board, whereas the M1 chips, they had two NAND flash chips. So if you bought a 256 gig model, which is the baseline, if you bought that as an M1, you would get two 128 gigabyte chips. And if you bought an M2, you would just get one 256 gigabyte chip. Now, the reason this is significant is because if you have two chips, you can write to them sequentially, so your read speeds are significantly faster than if you're only trying to write to one chip. So if you are looking to buy one of these new M2 machines, which if you are, you're going to be waiting a while to get them because the delivery dates have been pushed back significantly. I think it's back, and I think the earliest you can get one is like end of July, but the average that I've been seeing is like mid to late August, something like that. I mean, obviously it depends on the spec you get and the color and all that stuff. But yeah, you're gonna be waiting a while. But if you do want to get one, I would highly recommend upgrading the storage so you get at least 512 gigs, so you get that added benefit with the speed, so you don't have to deal with that performance hit and the SSD speeds. Which I guess it also should be mentioned, realistically, in normal people land, since you're probably going to be upgrading from a fairly old machine anyway, I doubt you'd probably even notice like the slowdown difference because you don't have the machines side by side, or you don't have last year's model to compare it to. Which again, like I mentioned in a couple episodes ago when we talked about tech YouTubers and tech Twitter being out of touch, that's kind of where it's rearing its ugly head. People comparing it against last year's model and against other models from the same year, being like, oh yeah, it's slower, and having this big gripe. Which, don't get me wrong, the fact that it's slower than last year is an issue. Don't get me wrong, that's not good. But at the same time, from what the vast majority of people are going to be upgrading from, it's still probably going to be faster than what they're coming from. So, for what it is, big whoop. But at the same time, yeah, that is kind of a bummer that it's slower. But like I said, if you're going to get one, look into upgrading the storage if you can. And the other major gripe that people had was it only had Thunderbolt 3 versus Thunderbolt 4, which I will admit, that is really annoying that they did that. I'm not sure why they did that. And the big thing for me on that is, like, I wouldn't necessarily care, but the fact that you can only get one external monitor with that is definitely a real bummer, for sure. But yeah, aside from those two things, I think the reviews are mostly pretty positive. And the last thing that kind of is technology related, although not really. If you're into space and astronomy at all, I highly recommend going and checking out the James Webb Space Telescope's pictures. They just released some really dope pictures, specifically the Carina Nebula picture, I believe. Man, does that thing look stunning. It is absolutely beautiful. So I highly recommend you going and checking those out. So let's now finally get into the episode. So today we're going to be talking about operating systems, which one's the best, and just kind of doing a head-to-head battle, doing a showdown, and seeing if you should consider switching from what operating system you're currently running. And spoiler alert, the results might actually surprise you, which honestly, once I ran through all of these possible scenarios and tallied up the points, I was actually kind of surprised with the result myself. But we'll get into that in the end. So the OS market share, according to netmarketshare.com, Windows is at 90%, macOS is at 7%, Linux is at 2%, and Chrome OS is 0.7% higher than it should be, aka it's at 0.75%. So personally, just kind of give a background on my experience with these operating systems. I used to be a Windows diehard. I used Windows exclusively up through partway through college, I'd say. And the main reason I got away from Windows was, so my first experience into macOS was sometime during my freshman year of college. I wanted to start getting into doing some iOS development. I wanted to play around with that. But the only way you can do iOS development is if you have a Mac. So one of my friends, DOS Dude 1, you should definitely go check him out on YouTube. He lent me a MacBook that I could borrow so I could do some iOS development on. And I didn't really use the Mac all that much, to be honest. I just kind of played around with Xcode a tiny bit, but I mean, didn't really do a whole lot with it. And then come my sophomore year, my Windows laptop just kept having problem after problem, which the irony is so I ended up getting the warranty on that computer, which I'm really glad I did, because Dell essentially, if you bought the parts individually for that computer that needed replaced and you exclude the labor costs for fixing it, I basically got a brand new computer. So yeah, that computer's kind of trash. I have since upgraded it to have an SSD rather than a 54 RPM hard drive, which was slow as heck. I also have it dual booted with Fedora on there, which one of my friends said I lost bougie points because I skinned it and modified it to make it look basically as much like Red Hat as I can. So it's basically like I'm running Red Hat, which is the enterprise version of Linux, which you have to pay for. So I tried to make it look like I'm running the paid version while, running the free version, essentially. So yeah, I'm cheap. So I have, personally though, I haven't really ran Linux as a desktop environment as my main daily driver. I really haven't, like, I have used Linux desktop, like as a desktop environment, and I've used it some, but just never as a daily driver. But going back to college, when my Windows computer was really having problems, I had to ship it off to Dell to get it fixed. I literally only had one option, and that was to use this Mac that I had, which I forget exactly what year it was. I want to say it was like a 2008, I think, 15-inch with a Core 2 Duo, I believe it was. I don't remember the exact specs, but I mean, this thing was kind of old. Seeing that, this was back in like 2017, I believe. So I was using an over 10-year-old laptop, with a Core 2 Duo, which, I say that I was using a 10-year-old laptop, yet my Mac that I daily drive right now, just as my regular desktop, is a 2012 Mac Mini, which is 10 years old. I also have a 2008 Xserve, which granted I don't really use at all, but that's from, 2008. And then I have a 2009 Mac Pro that I do most of my development work on now. And that thing is, 2009. So I say it like, this thing was so old and slow, yet I'm using machines on the daily that are older, which are basically the same age as that, but as far as like the years that have passed, they're older, which is kind of funny. But yeah, pretty much since that happened with my Windows laptop, I really haven't gone back to using Windows as a daily driver. I still use Windows on a fairly regular basis. I have two laptops for work, my main job, my day job. Both of those are Windows machines, and I hate them, mainly because they have hard drives. That's one of the reasons, and they're just insanely slow compared to my other computers, my personal computers. And they just have a bunch of, it's a, corporate laptop, so they're going to have all kinds of spyware on them, monitoring software and security software, which really slows them down. So that really also doesn't help them either. But yeah, like I said, I have experience with all of them. Linux, while technically I guess I have the quote-unquote least amount of experience with, basically every single one of the servers that I run and manage in my home lab that I also use on basically a daily basis all run Linux, except for I think like one development environment for Windows that I have running, and for like testing code purposes to make sure my builds work on Windows, and a Windows deployment service, which obviously has to be Windows. But aside from that, all of them run Linux because, as we're going to get into, Linux is the far superior operating system if you want to run a server, hands down. People will make the argument, yeah, Windows is good as a server too. No, not really. If you need Windows-specific stuff, sure, but like Active Directory, or Windows deployment service, sure, but literally anything else, use Linux. Just use Linux. It's so much better. So with that, kind of my background out of the way, let's get into this Showdown. So let's say that you just want an operating system that has the most compatibility with all types of software. You gotta give Windows that point there, mainly because, as we mentioned with the market share, 90% market share. I mean, if you're gonna make an app and you want people to use it, you gotta have a Windows version. That's just basically the bottom line. And then macOS is a close second. There is a lot of app compatibility for Macs. There's a lot of Mac ports, but you'll get into certain things, like especially with gaming, and then some other apps that just don't have macOS support. And then Linux, I mean, you can use Wine, I guess, or some other type supports, but yeah, the compatibility with Linux isn't as, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are definitely alternatives that you can use for Linux, for Windows apps, but if you want to use like the mainline Windows apps that, yeah, I say Windows app, but like the mainline apps that are most commonly used with Windows, using them on Linux could be a challenge. So say you, going to the next one, let's say you want to build your own PC and put an OS on it. What's the best operating system for you? Well, most people that build their own PC, not all, but most, are the PCMR people, aka the PC Master Race people, and they'll tell you Windows all the way. But I'd argue Windows or Linux. That's honestly a toss-up. You could go either one. It kind of depends on what your use case is. Obviously, if you're going to do gaming, Windows is probably the way to go, although there is a caveat there that Linux in recent years has been making some really big gains in the gaming area, specifically in the past few months, maybe past year or so. The rise of SteamOS and Proton compatibility has really taken Linux into, I guess, not necessarily the mainstream, but like it's really starting to gain some market share as far as the gaming community is concerned. So, maybe if you're trying to, building your own PC, want to play some games, or just building your own PC just because, Linux, I don't know, might be the option for you. I mean, I guess if you're a real madman, you could build your own PC and make a Hackintosh. But do so at your own risk. That is a rabbit hole in and of itself, and you have to make sure you're using specific hardware. And I've never done it, but I've heard can be quite the nightmare. Plus, like, as far as like future compatibility and like doing software updates and all that, can like completely brick your machine. So that's probably not the route you want to go. So yeah, if you're going to do a PC build, definitely Windows or Linux. It's kind of up to you based on what you're going for. So then the next one on our list here is development. So say you're a software developer, which is the best OS for you? So in my opinion, I'd have to, I guess I'll say this. The purely unbiased opinion is it doesn't matter, but because you can, as long as you have, whatever tools and languages downloaded that you want, you're generally fine. But as far as a quality of life question, I would say it's between macOS and Linux, depending on what you're developing for. Personally, I like macOS better, but then again, I'm biased towards that. I've also done plenty of development on Linux, and I enjoy that as well. But like I mentioned earlier, if you want to, do iOS development or macOS development, then you kind of are locked into macOS. I mean, I guess, sure, if you're a weirdo and do JavaScript for a living, sure, you can do your weird web cross-platform shenanigans and make cross-platform apps that way, but you still need to use a Mac in order to be able to, actually deploy the app to iPhones and put it on the App Store, I believe, so you still kind of need a Mac for that. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're developing for, but I don't know, maybe you give macOS a slight edge, although, I mean, Linux is just as good. And then Windows, I've mentioned it before in some of the previous episodes of the Dark Assassins podcast here, where developing for Windows specifically, like making, C++ apps and basically making apps that are native for Windows and not like a cross-platform thing like a Python or Java, they can just be such a pain in the butt. Because, you're doing your regular programming, and oh yeah, it works great on the Mac, it works great on Linux, nope, no, Windows does not like that. Well, guess I gotta write this function different for the Windows version. So that's always kind of annoying. So I guess moving on to the next one, ecosystem integration. This is macOS hands down. Mainly because Linux and Windows don't really have an ecosystem, which I guess, the people outside of the Apple ecosystem say, oh, the walled garden, which it 100% is a walled garden. You are absolutely correct. But with that said, if you are in said walled garden, it is a very nice place. The compatibility, the ability to hand off things from one Mac to the other, from your iPhone to your Mac, from your iPad to your Mac, just whatever. It is so seamless, so easy. It's great. Hands down, macOS gets the point there. So as we mentioned earlier, say you want to run a server, what is the best OS for you? Linux, hands down. Unless you're in a fringe use case like we mentioned, like you're managing a large network of Windows computers through some kind of Active Directory, then obviously you're going to need Windows for that. Or if you're doing, a Windows deployment service, obviously you're going to need Windows for that. But pretty much any other use case where you're going to need a server, Linux is by far the way to go, which is why the vast majority of servers on the market or out in the wild, probably hosting this podcast and hosting my website, your website, if you have a website, basically every website is running Linux or some flavor of Linux because it's just really good at being a server. So say you want the most privacy and security in an operating system, what should you go for? Now, some of you might think I would say macOS here, but actually, I'm going to give the point to Linux on this one. And that is because Linux, as you may or may not know, Linux is an open source operating system, whereas Windows and macOS are proprietary operating systems. Now, what do we mean by that? So by proprietary operating systems, we mean we can't see the source code. Us as normal human beings that aren't in or working for Microsoft or Apple, we can't see the source code. So we have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. I mean, sure, some people can kind of really dig into some of the, they can kind of dig into some of the code, through decompiling parts of the operating system and whatnot, but you can't actually, see the source code itself. So you can't, for example, you can't see if there are any backdoors, programmed into the operating system, or if there's any, telemetry stuff going on like Windows has, or any other kind of spooky weirdness that, could be baked into the operating system. Because it's proprietary, you can't see that. But since Linux is open source, what that means is you can literally go to the Git repo, which I believe is on GitHub, and you can look at the source code. You can go through line by line if you so want and see exactly what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on under the hood. So you can know for a fact that your operating system isn't spying on you or anything like that, sending your data to the cloud or whatever. And the other thing about that is, as we mentioned in a couple episodes ago when we were talking about the Flowina exploit with Windows, which actually I guess I don't know if I should give Microsoft credit for this or not. They did actually finally patch that. I think I don't remember when it was. It was a couple weeks ago, I think. So they did finally patch that, although it was openly exploited for months before it finally got patched. So the one nice thing with Linux is because it's open source, literally anyone can post updates to it, which some might say that's a bad thing, but at the same time, because it's community driven, if you push an update that's bad, it's just not going to be approved. And then if there is a vulnerability, because the whole community can get behind that and then patch that update really quick and push it out to everyone. So Linux gets the vote on that one. So if you want the OS with the least amount of bloat, again, point goes to Linux. You can run a super bare bones system with Linux if you want to. Windows installs a butt ton of bloatware onto it. If you've ever looked at the start menu on a fresh install of Windows, oh my gosh, is that bloated. Ads everywhere. Oh man, it's so bad. Which is honestly one of the reasons why I made a Windows deployment server. So I can make a custom Windows image so I wouldn't have to deal with all that bloaty garbage. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still like a little bit of bloat on there from just like pre-installed apps that I didn't necessarily feel like getting rid of. But like all the, the ads for like Candy Crush and all that garbage, that's all gone. I stripped all that out. But in a vanilla install of Windows, that's all there. And then as far as a vanilla install of macOS, I mean, you got a ton of apps that you probably won't use. Just to name a few here, like for me personally, I don't use the Home app because I don't have a smart home. There's Airport Utility, which unless you have like an Airport Extreme, probably not using that. And audio MIDI setup, I mean, I personally don't use that. I mean, there's some apps on there that come with macOS that I don't use that probably could deal without. But Linux, if you do a super basic install, like something like Arch Linux, for example, like you can basically only put on that system what you want on that system, which, as we'll get into another point later, is really good if you have a really limited system that doesn't have, very good specs. You can install a very basic version of Linux without much bloat on there because there's basically no bloat in it, and it can run pretty snappily. So Linux gets the point on that one. So the best OS for office tasks. Probably Windows or macOS on this one. And the only reason I say that is because in the corporate world, Microsoft Office is the quote-unquote gold standard. And people only seem to care about Office. They don't care about Apple's version of Office, which is their iWork suite, which is like keynotes, pages, numbers, and they don't care about Linux version of Office or LibreOffice or OpenOffice or any of the other alternatives. It's pretty much either the Google suite with like Google Docs and all that stuff or Office, which in fairness, if you're using Office 365 or like the online Google stuff, you technically, I think, can pretty much do all that in a browser anyway, so operating system really doesn't matter. So you could, I guess, kind of give the point to all of them. But if you strictly want an operating system that can run Office on it, then the point has to go to Windows or macOS for sure. So next up is customization. So if you want to customize your OS to your heart's content, Linux wins hands down. I mean, the amount of customization you can do in your desktop environment is unreal. I mean, I've personally made a desktop environment to I basically made a version of Linux that basically looks exactly like a Mac, pretty much, because I felt like it. And you can, make one that looks exactly like Windows. I mean, you can do pretty much whatever the heck you want, which I will say that's kind of one of the reasons why I've never actually switched to Linux full time as a daily driver, because how overwhelming that is, because of how many options there are for, distros of Linux, flavors of Linux, as people like to say. Because keep in mind, when we talk about Linux, I'm talking about the kernel Linux, but there are tons of different versions of Linux that you can run with different ways to install apps, or different package managers, which are the way that you install apps. There's Ubuntu, there's Kali Linux, there's Mint Linux, there's Fedora Linux, Red Hat Linux, Debian Linux, Pop OS, Elementary OS. There's a ton of different varieties of Linux. But under the hood, they're basically, for the most part, it's the same kernel. But, all the stuff above and how it functions is a little bit different. But, in the end of the day, it's Linux. Linux is Linux. But there's just a bunch of different versions you can run and a bunch of different desktop environments. And the amount of customization you can do can be very overwhelming, which honestly, it's like that. I don't remember exactly what the thing is called, but you basically are petrified because you have too many options. That's basically what it feels like with Linux at some points, because there's just so many ways you can do things as far as customization goes. So best command line. So this honestly is a toss-up, because PowerShell is definitely good. It's really powerful. Personally, I don't like it. I've never learned PowerShell. I guess maybe that's why I don't like it. But I think Bash and the various shells that are used in Unix-based operating systems, so macOS and Linux, is more versatile, especially for if you're doing any kind of development or sysadmin server work. Unless you're doing, sysadmin stuff for Windows, then obviously you need PowerShell. But I think Bash and those Unix-based command lines are better, so I'm giving the point to macOS and Linux. So, best OS for the price. Windows obviously loses because you have to pay for Windows. I guess you technically don't have to, but that's piracy, and that is bad. So macOS and Linux get this point because they're both free. Although I guess you could argue you pay for macOS when you buy a Mac, that Apple tax, quote unquote, that they say. Part of that you could say is for the operating system. But as long as your Mac is supported, updates are free, so you don't have to pay for them. I guess back in the day, you used to have to pay for the macOS updates, but in recent years, they've all been free, so you don't have to worry about that. So best operating system for the price, because macOS and Linux are free, they win hands down. So the most susceptible to cyber attacks, Windows, oh wait, that's not a good thing. So Windows most susceptible to cyber attacks, but honestly, it might not be for the reason that you might think. So if you're not super into the tech world, you hear that, Windows is the most susceptible to cyber attacks. That's because the developers are bad. Nah, not necessarily. That doesn't necessarily mean that Microsoft's developers are terrible. Arguably some of the software they make is kind of trash, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their developers are terrible. If we go back to the market share thing, Windows is 90% of the market share. think about it. If you're a attacker trying to infect as many systems as possible, you're going to go with the operating system that has the most market share, which is why Windows always seems to have vulnerabilities, and operating systems like, macOS and Linux seem to not have really any vulnerabilities, or very few. It's not because there aren't any vulnerabilities in them, or those developers working on Linux or the developers over at Apple are so much better. It's just that because so many more people use Windows, it makes Windows a much bigger target. So attackers focus in more on Windows than they do on, Mac OS or Linux. So I guess point goes to Mac OS and Linux on that one for not being as susceptible to cyber attacks. Woo! So the best OS for non-tech people. So your grandma, what's the best OS for her? I guess arguably you could say any of them, but realistically probably Windows or Mac OS. But arguably I would say whatever OS she's currently running, just have her keep running that because she knows it. Don't torture your grandma and make her learn a new operating system. Just don't do it. Unless you want to be called every day or every week for tech support, then by all means, make her switch operating systems, 100%. So the least intrusive updates, that would definitely be Linux. I would give Linux the point on that one. Mac OS would be a second, and Windows would be a dead last. I can't tell you how many times Windows has updated on me and restarted at literally the worst time that it could. I clearly remember one time when I was in college, I was sitting in class, I kid you not, and my computer decided, I'm going to install updates and restart now. I'm like, computer, I'm literally in class trying to take notes and learn, and you decide to restart on me. Why? And people will say, you can disable automatic updates and all that stuff. I've tried. I've had some success, but at the end of the day, it always comes back. It still always updates when I don't necessarily want it to. It's not fun. I'm pretty sure everyone's had an experience with Windows like that. With Linux, I've never had that problem. Then the nice thing with Linux is when you want to update, you can just type a command in the command line and you can update your system that way. macOS, you can kind of do a similar thing where you can, set to not automatically update and you can update when you want. So yeah, as far as the least intrusive updates, I would give Linux the slight edge over macOS on this one, and obviously Windows, you are dead last. So most compatible OS for hardware. So this one is a tight race. But I would have to give Linux the edge on this one. Obviously, macOS is a dead last because you can only run macOS on a Mac unless you're trying to hack something together on a Hackintosh, and even then, the hardware you can use is severely limited. So, yeah, macOS dead last on that one. Linux, so this is the reason I give the slight edge. So while you might not necessarily get the best driver support for like NVIDIA graphics cards, mainly because NVIDIA is being a stickler about open sourcing their driver for the Linux kernel. But the reason I still give Linux the edge on this one is because if you have an old, like I kind of alluded to earlier in the episode, if you have an older system that isn't quite as powerful, if you want to be able to use that system and breathe new life into it, Linux is always the way to go. There are some very low intensive distros of Linux out there that you could install that are very they don't use many resources at all, don't really tax your system, and because there's so little bloat on there, I mean, you can have a system that runs so slow, like molasses in January running Windows. You throw Linux on there and it feels maybe not brand new, but it's actually usable again. So that's why I have to give Linux the edge on that one. And also, as far as like modern component compatibility, it's still still pretty darn good and can rival Windows. But because of that, backwards support, being able to support older devices and breathe new life into them, got to give Linux the point on that one. Most plug-and-play operating system. I guess I got to give that to Windows. macOS could be, you could argue that, but Windows is just, you go through the out-of-box experience, or in my case, because I have a Windows deployment server set up and customized it in a way, I can just bypass all that and go right into the login when I install a new OS. But I mean, you finish that out-of-box experience and, you're ready to go. You're ready to do your computing. Maybe you have to maybe you download Word or the Office suite or something, but I mean, you're ready to go. Now you could say the same thing for macOS, but I always found, especially with macOS and Linux, whenever I do a fresh install of one of those, I'm always customizing and changing settings for a while afterwards. Windows, I usually, once I'm done installing it, I'm like, all right, we're good to go. Maybe I'll install a couple apps, but that's it. I don't really do much, customizing and tweaking like I do with macOS and Linux. So I would say if you want just the most plug-and-play operating system, probably Windows is the way to go on that. So let us tally up the scores. So if my math soothes me correctly, I'm giving Windows a total of 6.5 points, macOS 7 points, and Linux 11.5 points. So like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, I was surprised by the results. Me being a macOS user and a Apple, I guess you could say Apple fanboy, and lover of Apple devices and Macs in general, I personally thought that I was going to find a way to make macOS win this, but Linux actually has a pretty commanding win on this one, actually, and Windows barely loses to macOS only by 0.5 point. So, I'm honestly kind of surprised by the result. So with Linux being the winner, does that mean that it's the best OS and you should switch right now? Honestly, maybe, but probably not. And the reason I say that is because if you're running a computer right now as your main machine, wiping it and reinstalling a brand new operating system is honestly a royal pain in the butt. So unless you're, say, using Windows right now and you're just hating it and, something happens and that's just the last straw, then by all means, just go ahead, end it, and, install Linux. Or if you're gonna, be getting a new system, maybe rather than, maybe it ships with Windows, maybe you wipe it right off the bat and install Linux on it. Maybe, I don't know. Or if you have an old device lying around and maybe you want to use it again, but it's so slow, maybe install Linux on it. But the reason why I say maybe not switch to Linux per se is, like I said, also if you've never used Linux before, switching to it and making it your daily driver can be, like anything, like doing a complete reversal like that, there's going to be a learning curve learning a new OS. So, I don't know. I guess what I would do, if you've never used Linux before, and you're running, well, actually, it doesn't matter what other OS you're running. If you've never used Linux before, I'd highly recommend downloading some kind of hypervisor on your machine, whether that's VMware, or if you want a free version, VirtualBox, and download, they have pre-made VMs for Linux, for different distros, or you can download the ISO file and install it yourself, which personally I would go that route, since I would give you kind of some more exposure to the install process, and it's a lot of fun, in my opinion, to install operating systems like that. And then just, put it in a VM, play around with it, and see if you like it. If you like it, maybe the next time you buy a computer, or next time your computer crashes, or you need to wipe your drive to reinstall your OS, maybe that's when you switch to Linux. I don't know. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. I was kind of surprised by these results, but at the same time, even though I've never used Linux as a daily driver, I love Linux. I think it's a great operating system, and I highly recommend looking into it, whether that's you installing it as a VM, running it as a server, or whatever the case may be. Highly recommend it. So if you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member who you think would like to hear this showdown of macOS versus Linux versus Windows. And if you have a question, leave a rating and a review with your question in it, or email me at contact@darkassassins.com. Or you can click the link in the show notes below. You can also send me an email about what your thoughts are on this whole Windows versus macOS versus Linux debate. Am I right? Am I wrong? Leave that in a rating and review, or shoot me an email with that, and maybe I'll, if it's a good discussion, I might bring it up in a future episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Or if you have a comment that you or question that you want answered, leave that as a rating and review, or email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, and maybe it'll end up in a future episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. So that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.